Well, today, the topic I want to deal with is the cancel culture. Now, it's interesting. I find myself speaking on a topic that the phrase didn't even exist a few months ago. And if some of you have not heard of the term cancel culture, don't be embarrassed. It is just that this is a new phrase that's popped up. So what is cancel culture and why do we care? Well, like anything, especially new phrases, people define it differently. You can go on the internet and find a variety of different definitions. But I think key to the cancel culture, now my challenge today will be saying that fast every time I go to say it. The cancel culture is defined usually as an attack on someone's reputation or their employment based upon their ideology or based on a disagreement with their ideology or a disagreement with their practices. So for example, cancel culture might be if there's a college professor that's teaching something that the popular, mostly popular left doesn't like to have taught. They will shame that person on Facebook. They will lobby on Instagram. They will send letters. They'll protest, trying to shame that person or maybe get that college professor fired. The cancel culture also is really an attempt at intimidation. It's an attempt to get people to modify their attitudes or behavior for fear of being highlighted by bad press, bad publicity, bad social media, whatever it might be. I would argue too that not everybody, but for some in the cancel culture, it's an attempt to remove certain ideas from the public discussion. It seems like there's some ideas that are just not permitted in the modern culture. And so some parts, a microcosm perhaps, but a very vocal part of the cancel culture is people who don't even want an alternative viewpoint to theirs even to get a hearing. And we've seen, of course, censorship on Facebook and a whole bunch of other platforms where we see that evidenced. Fourthly, it's an attempt to remove financial resources from people that the cancel culture disagrees with. So to take business away from a business person, to take resources away from them, to make them less able to support a competing worldview. Now I have to say at the outset here that there is overlap between the cancel culture and the protests that we've been seeing over the last several months. The cancel culture and the protests are not the same thing, but there is significant overlap. Enough so that some of what is happening with the protests does fall under the cancel culture mindset. Now a few examples, and if you paid attention to the news, you've probably seen dozens of examples, but for those that haven't, let me just give a couple of examples of how the cancel culture is showing its head in our modern society. There was a pizza shop owner in New York who flies an American flag out front, as I understand, but in the back room of the pizza parlor, there is a Trump flag. Well, a customer came in, I believe for a takeout order, and looks in the back room and sees the Trump flag and is angry that this establishment would be a supporter of Donald Trump. So this person takes to Facebook to begin a boycott movement to get people to boycott this pizza parlor. So here's a businessman whose livelihood, his source of income is being challenged because in his back room he had a Donald Trump flag. And the end result was initially a loss of business to him. What did happen though, there was kind of a rebuttal that happened, and a lot of people began to say, oh, we don't think this cancel effort is good, and so we're going to try to patronize the pizza shop. And so a lot of business did come back. I don't know on balance if he was benefited or not. But it's a unique phenomena where now if you disagree with someone, you don't just take your business away from them, but you initially engage in a boycott. And this is a new aspect of the cancel culture. Another aspect of it is all the censoring on social media. You may have seen sections on Facebook or Instagram or other social media outlets where content has been removed because it's been fact-checked or because the opinion is not in the mainstream of American opinion. And this is a matter of some concern because those platforms are a major communication method for us. Google, their search results for a long time have been biased towards certain political perspectives. And now there's some, at least accusations that Google is actually censoring websites that it thinks don't fit within their acceptable public opinion profile. Well, what are the purposes of the cancel movement? Well, I've implied that already, but One is to change people's thinking. This is part of the battle over hearts and minds. Second of all, they want to change people's actions. So their effort to change actions, cause people to vote differently, to do business differently, to support different policies. And that's the third, is that the cancel movement is aimed at trying to get a change of government policies. And so that is the goal of the cancel movement. Now, the methods of the cancel movement, I think, are a mixture of both good and bad. And so that's something we need to talk about. It's very easy to paint something as all good or all bad. Part of their goal is that they want to educate people. Now, in some cases, it may be miseducation, but they want to change people's minds. They want to provide education from their perspective through it. They want intimidation. They want to get other voices to be intimidated and not speak up. And in some cases, property destruction has been a tenet for some of them. And the reason for property destruction, first of all, it puts more fear into people, so people don't want to challenge them for fear of property damage. But also the property destruction can result in what I call a boomerang effect, where actually it may result in a stronger police presence than you would have otherwise. And believe it or not, that's one of the objectives, which we may get to later. We'll see if we have time. So the bottom line is, I don't think we can say the cancel culture is all good or all bad. I think the world is good at presenting us with false narratives and false choices. We have not called it cancel culture, but for years we have had community standards in our communities. And a business who maybe displays a sign that's risque or sexually suggestive, that business might well be boycotted in Middle America. Matter of fact, there might be a petition drive to get that business to remove that revealing or risque banner or sign or picture. That is the public using their market forces, their market power, to change something to make it conform to community standards. This is not new. It happened in the Puritan era. It happened in early America, happened in Middle America, happened in the 19th century, the 20th century. So not all efforts to persuade people by the spending of your money or by petition drives or public relations, not all those efforts are bad. Those are tools that can be used for good or for evil. So I would like to present most of my content here looking at 4 different contrasts. And I think these are very important. And we can evaluate consumer activism and these contrasts in 4 different ways. Number 1 is government versus private. We need to look at cancel culture activities and say which of these are government actions and which ones are private. And I think that initially determines a fork in the road of morally acceptable or morally unacceptable. The second is reason versus emotion. Is what's happening based on reason or is it based on emotion? Number 3 is a good worldview versus bad worldview. We need to evaluate cancel culture that way. And number 4, we need to evaluate its heart. Is there a good heart or is there an evil heart? Basically, what is your attitude towards other people? Is it constructive? Is it engaging? Is it loving? Or is it hateful? So I want to look at cancel culture in those 4 contrasts: government versus private, reason versus emotion, good versus bad worldview, and good heart versus bad heart. And I'll spend most of my time at the top of this list because I think that's where the critical issues are. Let's talk about government versus private. First of all, I don't believe that governments should be promoters of philosophy or policy. Now that may seem strange to you because what do governments do? Governments have policy. But I don't think government should be promoting policy, nor should it promote philosophy. A good government is a reflection of the philosophy of their constituents. It is an executor of policy. It's an enforcement of policy. Government should not be an advocate in creating what policies are. So I think this is really important. We have to recognize that we don't want our tax dollars used to influence public opinion. Public opinion ought to influence our legislators, and the legislators ought to influence government policy. We don't want government itself influencing the people and influencing the electors or the legislators and then influencing government. I think some parallels might be interesting. If we allow government to influence policy in any particular way, I guess it's a little bit like a batter in Major League Baseball. And if the batter could call their own balls and strikes, what's the batter going to do? He's going to call the balls and strikes in a way that benefits him. The same way, if government can advocate for policies, or if a government is going to advocate for philosophy, it is going to advocate policies and philosophies that are beneficial to government, not necessarily the citizens at large. Or it might be similar by analysis to an employee who gets to set their own salary. You know, no business would allow that, but that's what happens when we allow government to advocate for policy. So government should not use its resources to promote ideas. It should not use the general taxpayer money to advocate ideas or policies that some taxpayers disagree with. I think that would be a theft of their money. And yet government does this all the time. Government runs radio ads. Lots of government paid for radio ads, some on smoking or health issues or seat belts or whatever, but these government ads also extend to climate change issues, air pollution, quality control issues, and these ads are not just informative. These ads are aimed at changing people's perspective or their worldview on an issue, and that happens all the time, should not be allowed. Some of you may have heard something called the Ad Council. The Ad Council is a nonprofit organization designed to do public service announcements. And they buy discount time on radio stations for public service type ads. But more and more now, you are hearing Ad Council ads, or ads that's paid for partially by the Ad Council and partially by Housing and Urban Development, or partially by the Ad Council and partially by the Air Pollution Control District. So these are situations the government's spending money to influence the population, and it ought not happen. A second way that it happens at local government is the inserts in your water bill. Oftentimes there's inserts that are not just informative. They're dealing with global warming. They're making fact claims that may or may not be true. They're advocating policies. Your water bill may have flyers promoting Earth Day or other politically charged events. Here's another example of government using its resources to influence the electorate. Grant making. Government gives lots of grants for various purposes, and oftentimes those grants are peppered with efforts to only give those grants to like-minded organizations, or to give grants that may include some effort of educating, I say educating the public. A fourth area is government media. National Public Radio and Public Broadcasting Service are separate nonprofit organizations, but they receive government funding. And these are media outlets that use that government funding to promote largely a pro-government agenda. And fifth, and maybe most important, government influences the citizens through the government schools. From kindergarten through the university system, government schools are using taxpayer money, not just tuition, but other taxpayer money as well, to advocate an agenda, to try to shift people's philosophies and ideas. So here's where we need to make sure we have a mindset that government should not be influencing public opinion. It should be a reflection, not a cause, an effect, not a cause. And so we should cancel the idea of government influencing public opinion. So there shouldn't be no government influence in public opinion, and we should work to change that. But let's talk about the private part of that. Is it okay for private parties to influence public opinion? Well, the answer is yes. Now, some people will criticize a business who shuts down an opposing viewpoint, saying, hey, wait a minute, what about my First Amendment rights? Well, folks, remember the First Amendment is only designed to limit government action. It is not designed to limit private action. First Amendment says that government shall make no law, or Congress shall make no law. So if a business wants to promote an agenda, they should be allowed to. If a business wants to censor what happens on their publication, technically by a property right, they should be allowed to, as much as we may disagree with it. So we have to recognize that. By the way, the term censorship is thrown around all over. I would argue that if a private party does it, it's not censorship. Technically, I think censorship is only when the government censors opinion, and that is wrong. I censor opinion in my household because I subscribe to publication A, and I do not subscribe to publication B. I'm censoring publication B, and that is my right as a citizen or a householder. On my business, if I've got a reader board outside where I can put up little movable letters, you know, and put a message to the community that drives by my business, I, as a business owner, will censor. Everything I don't put up there is private censorship. But I don't think this falls in the category of what we think about evil censorship. That evil censorship is when government tries to limit opinion. So private companies, private parties have a property right. And as much as we may not like it, the big social media companies have a property right. Facebook, Twitter, you know, whatever it might happen to be, they have a private property right to use their property. But the citizens also have a right to not patronize that property. And here's the aspect where I think we can't just say that the cancel culture is all bad. If I don't like what the New York Times has to say, I can cancel my subscription to the New York Times. If I don't like what Facebook does or allows, I can cancel my Facebook usage. Now, I, for one, would say that these large platforms, because they have become a community service, if I was an owner or a board member or a significant stockholder, I would advocate that these large social media platforms allow a diversity of opinion. So I'm not saying what I think they're doing is good, but I am saying that there's a property right to do it. But I think more importantly, we have to ask ourselves, why do these large corporations, and let me put all media together. Let's put CNN, New York Times, Facebook, Google, Twitter, all as one group, traditional media and social media. Why do so many of the large media corporations advocate for things that are socialist, that are atheist, that are relativism, and have bad worldviews? Well, a couple reasons I think come to mind. First of all, a lot of these companies got their near monopoly position because of government favoritism. There's some interesting articles out there about the early days of Google. Google got government money for some of their early research. They got preferential treatment on use of the internet in the early days, and maybe still do, I don't know. So oftentimes we see these near monopolies, we tend to call them oligopolies, and we see these near monopolies as a failure of the free enterprise system. But oftentimes they got more market share than they should have because they got extra government help in the early days. Helped them to be first adopters, first developers of technology, and to have more market share. So government oftentimes gives preferential treatment that causes an imbalance in worldview in the private sector. Number two, our regulatory environment. That reduces competition. The more regulations you put on, be it payroll regulations, workforce regulations, the harder you make it for the startup. And so the established companies have an advantage because they have legal teams, they have all these resources available to them. And I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but it seems like oftentimes big business does not oppose government regulation. The reason why is big business sees government regulation as a nuisance, but they know they can overcome the nuisance. Big business knows that their small and medium competitors may be more impaired by that nuisance. In other words, the regulation that hinders a large corporation and maybe hurts their profit a little bit may actually keep a medium-sized corporation out of the marketplace. So oftentimes government regulation is the friend of big business, and it is the enemy of the small and medium business. And so all the government regulations we have in our regulatory environment oftentimes are an impediment to competition. And that's why we don't see more competition in a lot of these marketplaces. So first reason why we have this problem is government gives preferential treatment sometimes to some companies. Number two, regulatory environment holds out competitors. Number three, and this is the biggie, another reason why we have this problem of the censoring and the biased media is our educational system. Folks, this is big. If you've seen me teach before, you know that I harp on this quite regularly. You have to ask yourself, why are all the key players at Facebook and Google and CNN and New York Times, why do they all seem to have an atheist, relativist, statist, big government philosophy? Well, by and large, the reason they do is because of their educational training. We're training people in our public schools, all through the colleges, to have this mindset. So when we do have a large corporation, if we've trained 80% of a generation to think like big government thinkers, to think like atheists, there's a good chance that our large corporations are going to be run by that 80%. And I think we cannot underestimate enough the problem in our schools, in our colleges, and our universities at causing this difficulty. I think also I might issue a fourth point here, and that is that when it comes to using our market power, Christians, constitutionalists, advocates for the free market, we tend to don't use our market forces, our market power, like our philosophical opponents do. Our philosophical opponents are much more committed to boycotting businesses they disagree with. They're more committed to spending their money with businesses that we do agree with. Let me ask you, if you share a worldview somewhat similar to IPS, how many of your buying and selling decisions in the marketplace are made in the context of the battle of worldviews? How often do you ask yourself whether it's a big corporation you're buying from or whether it's a local mom and pop business? Do you ask yourself, are my dollars going to a business that will use their money to promote my worldview? We don't ask that question. And oftentimes, we don't want to make the hard choices. You know, your favorite coffee, the coffee that tastes best, the one you prefer, may be from a company that uses a part of their profit to promote a worldview that you're opposed to. Are you willing to sacrifice your favorite flavor or design of coffee beverage in order to promote your worldview? And oftentimes we're not. And I think that's one of the differences why we have some large corporations and even small businesses, local businesses, who use their revenues for statist, socialist, or bad agendas. Okay, that is the public-private dissection. So the key part I want to review here with the public, that is government, right? Government should not be in the business of influencing public opinion. It should not be part of the cancel culture, and we need to get government to stop spending money to support public media or to do public service announcements. That should be cut off. And government should not be a player. On the private side, private parties are free to use their property, their printing press, their internet site to promote whatever agenda they want. But of course, we should be using consumer pressure to put a community standard on to counteract that. Let's talk now about the reason versus emotion. So much of the cancel culture is based on emotional feeling. A lot of times these actions that they want you to take, wearing a t-shirt, putting up a sign, they're really based on emotion. Have you ever wondered all the things that are happening in the cancel culture today? You don't hear that much overtly about the policy agenda. You hear them speaking a lot about take a stand, say something. A lot of it's a feel-good approach. Now those feel-good approaches can result in a shifting of public opinion and ultimately can result in policy. But oftentimes these groups are really after an emotional appeal. And people dive in and support the group not based on a logical reason, but based on emotion. I made a comment here in my notes. We have several generations of Americans who act on fear instead of reason. Their peer pressure, their desire to be accepted, their fear of rejection drives people more on how they act and what they do, and it drives them more than reason or logic. And I would argue, if I can level a criticism at the Christian community, the modern church in general, and there's lots of exceptions, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but in general, the modern church and the internet have produced a generation of young adults that are more susceptible to peer pressure than were their parents and grandparents. Let me say that again. The modern church, number one, and social media, number two, have created a generation of young adults that are more susceptible to peer pressure than were their parents or grandparents. For most of 100 years now, the church has been afraid to teach hard truths. The church has been afraid to tackle controversy. The church was afraid that someone in the pews, maybe a visitor, hears a hard biblical teaching and is annoyed and leaves. And so I think for a lot of Christians, we've been afraid to tackle hard issues. We've been afraid to teach the truth. Now, folks, don't get me wrong. I think every bit of truth that we teach ought to be taught with love and grace. But I think for too long, the church has been afraid to tackle hard issues because the church had the peer pressure from the pews. And if that's been true, is any wonder that generations now that come out of the church have the same fear that the church had? They may not think about it concretely, but subconsciously they learn to act in the same way. A church that's afraid of reaction to teaching hard principles will produce people, parishioners, who are afraid in the world to take hard stands or to wrestle with hard truth. Now, the second thing is social media has caused us to be more subject to peer pressure. People wear their hearts on their sleeves on social media, and they are afraid to be rejected. They're afraid to be criticized, many people, and so they just want to go along to get along. And so we produced largely a go along to get along culture. And I think maybe social media produces one of two extremes. It either produces this docile go along to get along culture, or it produces this high impact, in your face, get a reaction culture. Both are unnatural. And I think the in-between ground, where people don't just go along to get along, but people who have a strong opinion and hold it, but know how to hold it gracefully, that's the middle ground that doesn't seem to exist. We either get radicalism or we get alongism. And that's kind of where social media has put us. So we need a society based on reason and logic who can discuss hard issues. The next contrast is what I'm going to call good worldview versus bad worldview. And the bottom line is, if we are influencing society, if we're protesting in the street, if we're changing where we spend our money, if we're making Facebook posts about a business, the question is not always the method. The question is, what is the objective? Are we doing this for good reason? I don't mind someone engaging in cancel culture behavior if the goal is to save babies and stop abortion. If the goal is to get a business to stop supporting Planned Parenthood. Those may be good objectives for a cancel culture, kind of an advocacy. So the question really is not, should we spend our money with business A instead of business B? The question is, are we spending our money with the right business? Does business A have the right worldview or business B the wrong worldview? And the most active people in the cancel culture are promoting a worldview opposite to mine and probably an opposite to a lot of people in my audience today. And the fourth set of contrasts is, I call it the good heart versus the bad heart. Too much of the cancel culture is aimed at people. It is aimed at personalities, not ideas. We need to engage, and we need to teach the hard truth. And we should be on the attack, but we should not attack the people. We should attack ideas. We need to learn to persuade the people we deal with, to love the people, but to show why their ideas are wrong. And a lot of the cancel culture is aimed not at attacking idea, it's attacking the people who hold the idea. It's saying, boy, if this person has this idea, we want to get rid of them. If this person holds this idea, we want to punish them economically, instead of using reason. Folks, we need a society who has a good heart, where the evil is really the ideas, not the people perpetrating those ideas. Good people, or at least nice, reasonable people, oftentimes promote bad ideas. And that's what public discourse is aimed for. We should be able to do something about that. One thing I didn't mention earlier in the cancel culture is this whole idea of taking down statues and monuments. It's, every other day in the news, there's some statue or some monument being taken down. Why? Because the cancel culture is really wanting to change history, and they don't want us to even know certain parts of our history. So I was curious this morning about how many monuments might have been taken down. I found a couple of web pages. Every web page I visited that had a list said this is an incomplete list. But the one I found that was the most itemized, I counted, and in America, there have been 200 monuments removed in the last 2.5 months. Folks, 200. Now, some were removed by being torn down by protesters. Others removed by the city or the county or the regional government who put them up. But these are monuments to war heroes, both Confederate and Union. It's indiscriminate. They're tearing down monuments to people who advocated slavery. They're likewise tearing down monuments of people who opposed slavery. I think largely it may be ignorance on the part of the protesters. They're tearing down monuments to anyone who was Christian, monuments to missionaries, monuments to explorers, even monuments that just have scripture verses on them. It's mind-blowing what's happening here. This is part of the cancel culture. It is punishing an idea by saying we can't have a statue of this historical figure. And I think a lot of it is based in revisionist history. And you get away with this only because we have taught revisionist history in America for, I don't know, 60, 70, 80, maybe 100 years. We've been revising history. You know, they make out the Civil War to be only about slavery. And if you know your history well, you know that slavery was one part of the Civil War. But the Civil War was not all about that. The Civil War initially was about tariffs. It was about representation. So they want to oversimplify these issues. And a lot of these Southern generals were people who were on the record of being opposed to slavery. Many of them never even owned a slave, but were fighting for the South. And so there's this false thing. They want to make South all bad, North all good. And we got to realize, no, wait a minute. There was some good in the South, and there was some evil in the North. As a matter of fact, there were northern counties who were pro-slave counties, who continued to be pro-slave long after the Civil War was over. These are things that were in history books years ago. Of course, they've been expunged because the revisionist history repackages our nation's history. So here's the question. How should we react and engage with the cancel culture? Well, what are the problems? Number one, I think with the cancel culture, the problem is they're advocating oftentimes for the wrong things. Not all the time, but sometimes they're advocating for the wrong things. They're advocating for more government. They're advocating for redistribution of wealth, which ultimately this audience ought to know creates more poverty in the end run. Number two, they're making the issues, they're making their case against people, not against ideas. The cancel culture is personality and people-driven, not idea-driven, and that's one of the problems. Number three, they prefer emotion to reason. I think that's not universally true, but commonly true. Number four, they're using inappropriate means. They're violating property rights, and they're using a means to draw attention to their cause. It's not a good means. Folks, if our end goal is good, but we use an evil path or means to get there, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. If we have a good goal, we should limit our pursuit of that goal to means that are good means. And therefore, we should not destroy property, we shouldn't harm people, we shouldn't cause bodily injury to police. You know, the means matter. Ooh, I like that. The means matter. Maybe we'll get t-shirts on that. I'll get hate mail just for saying that, I'm sure. But folks, the means do matter. So here's the bottom line question. When we talk about cancel culture, should Christians engage in that? Should free market advocates engage in that? And I would like to say the term cancel culture is new, as I mentioned at the beginning. I would like to call it advocacy activism. We're actively advocating for something. And the cancel culture people, it's advocacy activism. And it can be good or bad. Should we engage in it? I think the answer is yes, we should. We just need to make sure we do it correctly. We need to make sure we're pursuing a true goal. We need to make sure that we're not running on emotion, that we're using reason. We need to make sure that we're using a good means to get to the end. We need to respect property rights. And we need to focus on ideas and not people. And remember that ideas can be enemies, but not people. Folks, we need to begin to engage in consumerism. We need to be careful where we spend our money. We need to counter the cancel culture by supporting businesses with a good worldview and maybe withholding our money from businesses with a bad worldview. And I think ultimately we have to engage in the marketplace's ideas and do it in a winsome and likable way. Yeah, are we at a disadvantage? Absolutely. People with bad worldviews, or at least worldviews contrary to ours, control most of the major media. But folks, we're not going to change this until we engage the culture, and I would say most importantly, until we take back education. As long as we have government educating our citizenry, we're going to have a citizenry that wants more government. Can I say that again? As long as government educates the citizenry, we will have a citizenry that wants more and bigger government. Now, this just seems insurmountable. I know, seems too big to you. But folks, every journey, even the journey of 1,000,000 miles, begins with one step. Right now, we have opportunities. We have a lot of people who can't put their kids in the traditional public school, or at least can't do so traditionally, because the schools aren't meeting, right? They're trying to school at home, they're trying to use the teacher's curricula. It's a lot more work, a lot more expense to the family. Folks, this is a time to encourage those people to enroll their students in a local private Christian school or to enroll in homeschooling. I shouldn't say enroll in homeschooling. You shouldn't enroll in homeschooling. But you should disenroll from the government school and begin to homeschool. Those of us who have history with homeschooling or private schooling, we need to be reaching out and guiding people gently to exit from the public government schools. And by the way, when you say public school, that really means a government school. And we also should explore alternatives on social media. I don't want to endorse the two I'm going to mention because I don't have a lot of experience with them, but there are two up-and-coming social media sites that you need to know about. Explore them. One is called Parler, P-A-R-L-E-R. I think you can download the app or go there on parler.com. A number of my friends are switching there. I expect soon IPS might have a Parler presence. Another one is a web platform by Jordan Peterson, who, if you have not explored some of Jordan Peterson's material, worth listening to, reading, and watching. And he is promoting a social media platform called ThinkSpot, T-H-I-N-K-S-P-O-T. And again, not necessarily an endorsement of either, but folks, we should explore those. And it doesn't mean we still can't use Facebook to promote an agenda when possible, but at some point, people, we need to vote with our feet. And you know what? On election day, every year we get riled up and say, oh, this election is the most important election ever. We were talking in our office, and we talk about this every 2 years and then in every 4 years, that everybody says, oh, this election is the most important one ever. I've been hearing this since 1968. I remember hearing my parents say this when I was a youth. And maybe it's true. Maybe every election is the most important one ever. But the truth of the matter, folks, is that the elections of today and tomorrow are really won by what's taught in the classroom 10, 20, and 30 years before. Yeah, this next election's a big one. It's important. Is our society destroyed if we lose this election? Well, it's harmed, but I don't know that it's destroyed. My parents thought society was going to be destroyed if LBJ won, you know? The bottom line is we have to begin to think both short-term and long-term. And we have to think long-term. How do we long-term change hearts and minds so that we change the course of elections 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and 30? And a person with vision is a person who's 80 years old and has a vision for changing elections 30 years down the road. You know you'll never see it, but you know it's the right thing to do, and you know God will bless it, and you know your grandchildren will benefit. Folks, we need to begin to vote with our wallets and how we spend our money. We have to engage the culture. We have to develop alternate social media platforms. We need to support alternative media. And we've got to teach the truth. And most importantly, we have to work to get our churches to promote private Christian education. Okay, those are my comments on the current movements, particularly the cancel culture.